But, you know, when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, give me liberty or give me death, the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him.
Peace, peace, peace. I am Dr. Philip Roundtree, and you are tuned into the March 10th edition of Rhetorically Speaking. Props to those of you who are listening on whatever audio streaming service you're paying $15.99 a month for. Props to those of you who are watching on YouTube and the Twitch at Black Media Nexus. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. So today we're talking about power, politics, and priorities. 60 years after Bloody Sunday, voting rights are still under attack. So what are we really commemorating? Also, Philly just moved $91 million for America's 250th celebration. But is it an investment or a missed opportunity? Stephen A. Smith versus Bronny James and LeBron James. Is this a fair critique or just another example of double standards for black athletes? And last but certainly not least, for the Black Thought of the Day, we're unpacking the manufactured panic over trans athletes because the numbers don't match the outrage. So let's get into it. So yesterday, March 9th, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma. I don't even necessarily know I would call it a celebration, right? It's an anniversary. Is history repeating itself? Now, what happened in 1965? 600 civil rights activists led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, demanding voting rights for black Americans. When they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Alabama state troopers and local law enforcement brutally attacked them with clubs, whips, and tear gas. The violence, later called Bloody Sunday, was broadcast nationwide, shocking the country and fueling support for voting rights. The outcome? This led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned racial discrimination in voting and required federal oversight of certain states with histories of suppression. Now, where are we now in terms of the Voting Rights Act? In 2013, you had Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, removing federal pre-clearance requirements. So when we're talking about federal pre-clearance requirements, what this part of the Voting Rights Act said, for a certain amount of states, all in the South, who had a history of racial segregation, a history of oppression, a history of violence against black and brown folk, they had to get clearance from the federal government in order to make any changes. So we're talking about things like redistricting, right? That was gutted. Between 2020 and 2023, over 100 restrictive voting laws passed in 31 states, disproportionately impacting black and brown and young voters. An example, in Texas, they enacted a strict voter ID law right after Shelby. In Georgia and Florida, they passed laws limiting absentee voting and reducing ballot drop boxes. In Tennessee, you had new voter suppression laws disproportionately impacting black voters. And as of 2 years ago, in 2023, you had an Alabama redistricting fight where the Supreme Court ruled the state diluted black voting power, forcing the creation of an additional majority black district. So when we look at states like Florida, like Alabama, and specifically Florida to use as an example of what things like redistricting looks like, so you can all understand. So you have Duval County, which is a predominantly black area, right? You know that's where Little Duval, the comedian who I have my thoughts about, that's where he's from. The idea behind it, right, pre-redistricting, is to say, hey, we have this group of this community, and they should have a say in what's happening with them, right? And they should have this representation in, let's say, Congress. So what happens? If you have somebody that's running from Duval County, who's voting, let's say it's 61% black, you know that they're going to get representation. All right. Now, what happens is you have Florida, Ron DeSantis, who says no, and his cronies who says no. Listen, what we're going to do, we're going to split Duval County up. We're going to split these black folk up. So now we have, let's say, 30% over here and 30% over here in predominantly white districts. What does that do? That limits their voice. So now they're left subject to the whims of white folk, Republicans, who don't serve their interest. And so when we talk about this idea of preclearance, which was overturned some 12 years ago, this is saying, hey, we don't have to get approval. We can just go ahead and do what we want to do. Now, some of the arguments from the red states was just like, hey, why are you still holding us accountable from what happened in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s? We're long past that time. But you and I both know that this has continued. Voter suppression has perpetuated. No matter my thoughts about voting, for those who opt to engage in this process, they should have a voice that represents them. And so when we have this 60th commemoration, where you have folk who go to Selma, you have Al Sharpton, you have who's that? Hakeem Jeffries. When you have these individuals go to Selma, optically speaking, for those who don't have a history of what's taking place, it's extremely powerful. For me, who's a firm believer that, hey, we need memory, young folk today, they need to recognize that the fight that they're fighting has always been fought. But there are some who say, listen, is this performative? Are these commemorations performative? As we're actively losing the rights that they were fought for. And some could say, hey, that's a compelling case. But in a world where we know that the optics, that visually seeing something matters, I personally think it's vital that for every year since those 60 years, that somebody shows up. Now, ideally, it would be whom? It would be the elders like we see in this picture. But it will also be the young folk. Now, I'm not going to say that young folk weren't represented here by any means. Because why? I wasn't there. But if we're talking about passing the baton, which is always an issue when we're just having intergenerational conversations, especially in politics, where folks serve for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We see the Queen Maxine Waters there, who served black folk, who served in government on behalf of black folk for a very long time. What does passing the baton look like in these situations? When do the old heads get the rest? Some of the pushback when it comes to Al Sharpton, when it comes to Jesse Jackson, who you also see in the picture, is that their time has come. They need to pass the baton. Why are they still what's the term? Profiting off of black pain, still showing up in these spaces when it's something, when a case has notoriety. And part of that answer is, and I'm not going to take credit for this idea, but there's no retirement plan for an activist. There's no 401k for an activist, for those who dedicate their lives to the struggle. Part of their existence, a huge part of their existence, as I'm learning, is rooted in community. So we have to show up. Now, if I'm 70, 80, 90 years of age, I got to be a little bit more strategic about how I'm showing up. I don't know if I can necessarily show up in a community where a cop is just verbally harassing black folk, like we saw with the Eco Foundation. If you follow me on social media, where a black cop was harassing black kids, black young people who were delivering food to their neighbors. I don't necessarily know if we need Al Sharpton for that, Jesse Jackson for that, Maxine Waters for that. Yeah, we need to conserve their energy. We're going to talk about LeBron James later. It's no different. The playoffs is much different than game 22. No less impactful for sure. But this is where we lean on the young folk. This is where the young folks step up in situations like this. And I will say, because I don't necessarily like the narrative that young people, and I consider myself fairly young, comparatively speaking, that young folk aren't showing up, that young folk aren't speaking out. We see this in jobs across the country, where folk are saying, no. Use my pronouns. No. You're not going to just work me to work me. I need living wages. You know what? We need to unionize. We need to come together. That's what I'm seeing. But as far as in the political landscape about who's running for office, yeah. I do think some folk need to step aside. Our elders need to step aside. There is some idea that, hey, there needs to be some rites of passage. You need to earn this. And I understand that. But ultimately, we're going to sink or swim based on the young people. That's been the case throughout history. And so in remembering this 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which actually took place on March 7th, but it was commemorated on the Sunday because of it fits, right? It fits. But it had me thinking, why does black voter suppression remain a political strategy in 2025? And the answer is simple. Because white supremacy recognized where the power lies. It recognized that the power lies in the people. It recognized that the power lies in black folk and brown folk. Because if you can suppress the voices of black folk in this country, who this country was built on, then what does that mean for our brown brothers and sisters? What does it mean for those who come from other countries? What does it mean for women? And then we also recognize that this exists because this country really focuses on this idea of this black-white binary, which is this idea from critical race theory, the true critical race theory, where it's just like, hey, you got white folk, you got black folk. This is the focal point of society, and then everything else just finds its way in, gets in where it fits in, which makes sense. Why? Why does it make sense? Because again, black folk built this country, right? And then we had other folk come in. And I hate to say, built the country in the context of the settler colony of America. Because when we just talking about the land, we know just the indigenous folk land. They really built all of this, right? And so, of course, it makes sense Because the lack of representation that you have in politics, as we see present day, the lack of representation means we could just go willy-nilly. We could do whatever the hell we want. And that's what's taking place. And so if you can redistrict, if you can eliminate the voice of who black folk say that they want in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, but more so the House of Representatives, then again, that's one less voice, one less powerful base that we have to worry about. Now, when it comes to this idea of what should modern voting rights and activism look like today, it should look like what's happening in this picture in Selma. It should look like people being in the streets day in and day out, pushing back against fascism, but not only in the streets. Because I do recognize that you can have 1 million people in the streets, but as currently constituted, as this country is currently constituted, you also need individuals in government. You also need individuals within these political spaces that represent the voice of you in your community to advocate on your behalf. Because then what happens? When we talk about the case of Shelby, who are the Supreme Court justices? If a case makes it up that far, you got your Amy Coney Barrett's, you got your Kavanaughs. You have all of these folk who are what? Conservative, right-wing folk, MAGA folk, and put in place by 45/47, which then allows what to take place? The striking down of voting rights, the striking down of affirmative action, the striking down of women's rights. And so there has to be a concerted grassroots effort, ideally to elevate somebody from the grassroots, because every brother ain't a brother. We've seen that with the 10 Democrats that voted against Al Green. Not that Al Green, but who voted who voted to censor Al Green for his outbursts at the State of the Union given by 45/47. And I'm telling you, and I've said it before, the pink T-shirts, the holding up signs, that was definitely performative. Yes, that is a form of activism, but it's like the lowest form. But ultimately, these are the people who many of us feel should be doing more, who should be willing to risk it all. But then the argument can be what? Who's going to represent you if they get censored? And we know censored isn't really anything meaningful. But if they find themselves on the outs, who's going to fill their spots? But you have to have a multifaceted approach. And this is why we laud folk like Stacey Abrams, who figures out ways to do the work to do the groundwork and have that manifest into the political realm. And so we celebrate the ancestors. We celebrate the current elders who was present for Bloody Sunday, who truly risked it all on behalf of black folk. Again, we salute you. Just like the what is it? Showtime at the Apollo, right? Where they sitting down. It's like it'd be Kiki Shepard. I forget what she said. But we honor you, we salute you, we appreciate you. And with that being said, from Selma to Columbia, different era, same damn playbook. When people fight for change, the system fights back. Just ask Mahmoud Khalil, who's now facing deportation for protesting. Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University engineering student and Palestinian rights activist, was arrested by ICE for an expired visa, allegedly. Right? Because I don't trust anything that they say. Khalil was a visible organizer in pro-Gaza protests on Columbia's campus. Supporters say his arrest was politically motivated, part of a broader crackdown on student activism. Since the Gaza war began, at least 30 student activists across the U.S. have faced legal action for protesting. I sat and I read that story. Mahmoud Khalil, who's, I believe his wife is 8 months pregnant, arrested in his apartment. ICE stated that they had direct orders to revoke his visa. But the truth of the matter is, he actually was a green card holder, and they were revoking that instead. So now he's in a detention system. To date, they've been unable to locate him in said system. And ultimately, this alleged crackdown is all a part of this government's attempt to prevent anti-Semitism on college campuses, to prevent free speech in this country. Now, Columbia University has become a focal point of the efforts of the government. Why? Because the protests have been continuous there. They've lost approximately $400 to $500 million in federal funding. But the question is, why are they receiving so much money anyway? When they have what? An endowment of what? Some billions of dollars? But ultimately, schools are being pressured to punish pro-Palestinian activists. This isn't nothing new. The U.S. has an extensive history of using immigration laws to suppress dissent. They've used this to monitor MLK, Fred Hampton, Assata Shakur. And so this ultimately raises questions about, is there such a thing as free speech in this current, in America as it's currently constituted? And is this starting a dangerous precedent? And the answer is yes. For the next 4 years, we will see protesters who aren't citizens deported. Why? A lot of this is because they can. A lot of this is because they can. Does it make sense? Honestly, yes. It does make sense. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I'm in favor of it. But much like the pushback against critical race theory in schools where they're banning books, we've seen within the last 72 hours the government doing a deep dive and finding all quote-unquote woke terms throughout the government, one being female, which is a woke term allegedly, and attempting to do away with them. It makes complete sense. Why? Because if we have this idea of patriotism, right? If you have this idea, and I think that's where folk tend to to take the privilege that comes with being America for granted. Because we know that in other countries, in dictatorships, right? If the goal is to have a dictatorship, then no, you don't want anybody speaking out negatively about you. It's just like, no, damn, dog. I do all this for you. No. You gotta roll. You gotta get up out of here. So it makes sense if you understand who you're working with. It makes sense when we look at the current administration. If this is which one of them Koreas is it? North Korea with Lil Kim? Getting folk up out the paint. Look at any place where you have a dictatorship, where folk want to do what it is that they want to do. You can't talk about the government all crazy, or there are consequences. Morally, is it right? Of course not. Of course not. But in the context of what they trying to do, of course it is. Of course it makes sense. But what should universities be doing in these instances? Should they be doing more to protect students from political repression? The money, cash rules everything around me. These public universities are beholden to the government. Why? Because that's where they're getting bread from. You're not going to hear me cape for any of these universities because they've all excluded persons of the global majority. They've all have been spineless throughout their history. But should they be doing more? I don't know the demographic breakdown at Columbia. Now, if the majority of your student body are immigrants, then you probably should. You probably should. But then what'll happen? You'll end up like Columbia University. You'll come under the ire of the president. Which, I don't know about y'all, folk. I understand why folk don't want that. What does it mean to be under the microscope of the president of the United States? Some of y'all can't navigate your boss. And also, how are they going to be sustained if they do come to the aid of students? Now, I don't know how much of that money, that non-federal money from Columbia, comes from folk whose perspective aligns with 45/47, and those who come from, your donations from past graduates, or those who have a more liberal mindset. Odds are it's those who align with MAGA. Why? Because you don't make that type of money. You don't make hundreds of millions of dollars. Corporations don't make hundreds of millions of dollars. But because they care about the rights of and freedoms of the people. I don't care how liberal the folk try to sound. If somebody making sneakers that cost $11 and they paying folk $2, do they really care about people? Probably not. And when you become a millionaire, when you become a billionaire, the goal is to maintain that. You ain't trying to lose that. And so I'm on both sides of it. I understand why they don't, because they like, yo, y'all just chill. Y'all just relax for a minute. Reminds me of like Daddy Daycare. With Eddie Murphy, when the kids was just wilding. He like, yo, can y'all just relax, man? We just try to get through the day. We try to get you all these degrees. Because this also goes against what the university is today, ultimately. Right. And so when you see folk like Mahmoud who are organizing, who are applying the lessons that they're supposed to be learning in these places of higher education, this advanced learning, when you see him applying it, it's just like, oh yeah, this is what's supposed to be happening. You're supposed to be quote unquote smarter. You're supposed to have a more a bigger outlook, a stronger outlook on the world, because you're interacting with folk from different places. You're being challenged to expand your horizons. That's what I was looking for. But that's not what colleges, the majority of colleges are. They're job mills. Let's get you from point A to point B to then get you out in these working streets. That's just what it is. But yeah, this is definitely going to set a precedent for activists of all causes. Whether it's climate change, whether it's police reform, whether it's labor rights, folk are going to be targeted. I don't know what that looks like for me and for who's, I'm out there sparingly. I try to get behind the mic and have conversations. But I'm sure that's next up too. Because I'm sure even if Mahmoud had gained millions of listeners pushing back against Columbia University, pushing back against 4547, they was going to hit him up the same exact way. You've become too powerful. Remember that scene in Malcolm X? Where Malcolm was like, Denzel playing Malcolm was like, and white man was like, what's that white man from? What's that show? Raymond. What's it? Raymond something? Whatever that Raymond show is. He's like, oh, no one, that's too much power for one man. And they gonna come and get you. And so ultimately, we pray for Mahmoud's release. Before I transition to the next topic, I'm just considering his wife, 8 months pregnant, the stress of not knowing where her husband is because he's been taken by the government. Oh, the mental and physical anguish that can cause. And so definitely sending prayers to her, but keep fighting the fight. Those of you who are out there, who are in the streets, those of you who are behind the microphone, keep fighting the fight. Because if we don't, they definitely won't think they could do anything without impunity, with impunity rather. And so the government always finds money for enforcement. But when it comes to funding communities, that's up for debate. Like Philly's $91 million budget shift. So as we shift to our next story, shout out to the homie Isaiah Thomas, who's whether rightfully or wrongfully, has become the face of this $91 million budget transfer. Because he is a part of city council. He is the whip. So Philadelphia City Council approved reallocating $91 million from the general fund to support the 2026 U.S. semi-quincentennial celebrations. For those not in the know, that's 250th anniversary. Some of the funding will go to SEPTA for transit funding for infrastructure improvements. $46 million will go to event prep, vehicles, software updates, city beautification. $4 million will go to security, new police radios, security cameras, fire department, tactical gear, and health inspections for food vendors. $3 million to Visit Philadelphia, 500 to Mural Arts Philadelphia, and we're gonna save a little 100,000 for the Adune Day Festival. Now, where does the money typically go? The money typically goes to essential services, child welfare, the behavioral health crisis lifeline, and juvenile justice services. The politics behind it. The good homie council member Isaiah Thomas pushed for funding, citing economic benefits in Philly's global spotlight in 2026. Critics argue that while the celebrations bring tourism, essential services like those previously identified are underfunded. So is this budget shift prioritizing tourism and infrastructure over urgent community needs? Of course it is. Of course it is. And it's not, Isaiah didn't just do this on his own. City Council unanimously agreed to this. Why? Because you got folk coming to your home. Think about it like this, right? And we see this especially on Super Bowl Sunday. Folk might like, oh, you know, we're gonna have a Super Bowl party. We're gonna have a Super Bowl party. You know what? We're gonna clean up, right? We gotta clean the crib. So we might hire some housekeepers. But you know what we also gonna do? We're gonna go buy that 60, 70-inch television. Why? Because we got people coming, y'all. And we gotta make sure that things look good. But dog, we ain't paid the rent. That's cool. It's cool. Listen, we good, because what's gonna happen is folk gonna come, right? They're gonna enjoy themselves. That's worth it. And what'll happen is, might have some connections here, make some connections. It might bring in some more money. And so we looking at this little $1,000 that we paying for this TV. This might help us get 5,000 from folk who come to the crib, who bring their connections. I might be able to shake hands and kiss babies at this Super Bowl party. And that's what they're banking on. All right? That's all it is. They're trying to present themselves to investors who may be coming. They want the crib to look beautiful. At what expense, though? Some urgent community needs. The Juvenile Justice Center has continuously been overpopulated. What does overpopulation mean? We need more people. We have to have more individuals there who are working to observe, to work. What does this mean in terms of child welfare? Money that goes into foster care. And a lot of this money typically goes to just paying people. It usually just goes to just paying people. But with those three places, behavioral health, the crisis line, and juvenile justice, or child welfare rather, not specifically behavioral health, even though that also gets a huge part of it. It goes to just paying people to do their job. And so with this shift that's happening, they're going to do what? They're going to have to go to somewhere else to get money to bring back over here. Now, part of being a politician is to say, hey, we know what's best for y'all. We recognize what's best for a community. Yeah, I know you think you know what's best for you and what's best for your community and what's best for the city at large, but we have to think big picture. And so, yeah, if we got to move money from this one place, which may or may not be hit, so we can have something, so we can have potentially bring in more money in the next 5, 10, 20 years, then that's just what we have to do. Does it justify the reallocation? I'm glad I don't have to answer that. Because some folk might not even be around. When you try, when the rubber hits the road, when it's saying, hey, what did 5 years from now, in 2031, what did this bring in? And if you can't say it, you know what? Because I don't think double would be enough. You can't go 182 million. If it hasn't brought in 3, 4, $500 million, then no, it wasn't. But the consequences of the decision making also will be seen in 5, 6, 7 years. Where we're still talking about, hey, these places are dramatically underfunded. Or maybe that's what they recognize. Like, hey, you know what? These are always underfunded. So by moving some money around to beautify the city for 1 year, we just got to do what we got to do. I don't know. Time will tell as I adjust my seat. Money moves differently depending on who benefits. Same with opportunities. Like Bronny James. Bronny. He's catching heat for something that's common everywhere else. So if you've been under a rock, if you don't necessarily watch sports, but it's been everywhere. LeBron James confronted ESPN talk show host, hell, he's the face of ESPN at this point, Stephen A. Smith, who criticized his son Bronny, saying he's only getting NBA attention because he's LeBron James' son. Tell us something that we that we don't know. And so that always brings up the debate. It happened when he was drafted. Nepotism versus earned opportunity. Now the question is Bronny being unfairly scrutinized? Who cares? And that's where I'm at with Bronny James. Who cares? I don't have the time. I don't have the desire to worry about the scrutiny of Bronny James. Now, I'm not one to say, hey, well, white folk do it all the time. It happens in Hollywood. Nepotism happens in Hollywood. It happens in Wall Street. Yeah, it does. It does. I can acknowledge that. If I had the opportunity to have my son, Lil PJ, or have my daughter, Lil KK, now it's big KK still, but put them in a position to win, of course I'm going to do it. But I'm also doing that with the realization that if it's a front-facing position, that you know what? It's going to come with a little bit more critique. Now, some argue, is it critique or is it criticism? I mean, it's probably a little bit of both if we're being honest. But if we understand the sensationalism of not only sports talk radio, but we just got finished talking about the political space, that's what these shows are. It's not even necessarily debate. They're just spaces for sensationalism on topics that will drive ratings. And LeBron James has done that. LeBron James is the most scrutinized athlete of all time. It's not even close. Why? Because he grew up in the social media era. He got his start at the beginning. And he's still out here. And so if you want ratings, if you have nothing else to talk about, you talk about LeBron James. And he's handled it like a G. He's handled it like a G. No scandals, unless you really get into like the blogosphere and all of that. But nothing that would have you, from the outside looking in, questioning his character as a human being. But we got to remember, we don't know these people. And so what happens? his son has grown up in this spotlight as well. Now, this would have happened if Michael Jordan's sons, if social media was around during that time, same thing would have happened. Dwayne Wade's son, well, first, Dwayne Wade isn't as great as LeBron, all-time great player, but he wasn't on ESPN since he was 16, 15. That all plays a part. So when his son Zaire goes into the G League, the fact that he got into the G League is a question. Hey, is it because of your pop? And so it's only magnified when you're arguably the greatest player in sports history of all time. Folks say, well, Bronny is an adult. So why is LeBron stepping to Stephen A like that? First, him stepping to him at a game, that's corny. That's nutty. I may have done the same thing, but I can still highlight nutty behavior. Through all the channels that you can contact this man, you want to do it out here. Why? Because you know what you're doing. Or maybe just the impulse. It was just a lack of impulse control, which also happens. So we want to show grace in that regard as well. But to do that in the open, it's corny. Again, I would have done it too, potentially. But yes, Bronny is an adult. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. This is a part of it. When you're Bronny James and LeBron James and y'all making decisions, well, you know what? He's going to travel on the road with the Lakers, and he's only going to play in the G League when they have home games, instead of honing his skills. Why? Because he has a guaranteed contract. So he's going to be in the NBA for the next, after this year, I think another 3 years, guaranteed. Or he's going to get paid. He has guaranteed money to be paid, which is not characteristic for somebody drafted in the second round. This happens because of who your dad is. This only happens because of who your dad is. His contemporary, Isaiah Collier, who was drafted in the first round by the Utah Jazz, 29th overall pick, some 5 or 6 spots before Bronny. He was highly touted coming out of high school. Subpar college career at USC alongside Bronny James, who didn't get to play because of his heart condition, and we're glad that he's okay. Now, Stephen A. Smith was making comments about his heart, his health. That, yeah, you got to get, I'm Martin Luther King, not violent, but somebody got to get slid. But we're talking about his play. We're talking about the optics. And so Isaiah Collier isn't getting the spotlight in this regard. Why? Because his dad wasn't the GOAT. So heavy is the head that wears the crown. This is what comes with connections, having connections and having privilege, which happens in every other industry. You got to live up to it, or you don't. And if we're talking about manufactured debates, this next one might be the biggest yet. We are now entering what I like to call Dr. Phil's Black Thought of the Day. This week, Governor Gavin Newsom weighed in on transgender athletes, suggesting that some sports may need separate categories to balance fairness and inclusion. If the Democratic governor of California, one of the most progressive states, is saying this, you know where the conversation is headed. But let's look at the facts, not fear-mongering. There are over 500,000 college athletes in the U.S. You know how many are transgender? Approximately 10. At the high school level, with 8 million athletes, that would mean roughly 160 trans athletes nationwide. That's 10 out of 500,000 in college, 160 out of 8 million in high school, and yet we're being told this is some national crisis. Look, it's okay to be conflicted about how trans athletes compete. Sports have always debated fairness and inclusion. But what's not okay is pretending this is some massive problem when the actual numbers are microscopic. Some of y'all are typing more letters in your angry responses than there are actual trans athletes competing. That's crazy. So, what's really going on here? This debate isn't really about sports, it's about power. We're caught in a system that teaches us men are superior to women, men shouldn't hit women, but women aren't as capable as men. The whole trans athletes are destroying women's sports argument is built on that contradiction. The same patriarchy that undervalues women's sports is now pretending to protect them. Make it make sense. Let's be real. This issue is a political tool to rile up voters, distract from real policy failures, and fuel culture wars. They don't care about fairness. They care about control. And they've got people fighting over a problem that barely exists instead of focusing on real inequities like underfunded women's programs, athlete health care, and the exploitation of college players. So before we go into full outrage mode over a fraction of athletes, ask yourself, why are they making us fight over this instead of fighting for actual equity in sports? The game isn't on the field. The game is being played on us. Listen, I appreciate you all for tuning in. Remember, like, comment, subscribe at Black Media Nexus or wherever you're listening or watching this. Until next time, peace.